If you were here last Sunday, you know that it was a challenging topic to address. I got some pushback. In between services, one of our sweet seasoned saints came up to me and said, "What do you think you're doing preaching a sermon like that here?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she said, "We've already got too many kids." She said, "We're having to build a building to house them all, and then you go and do something like this. What are we going to do?" And she kind of chuckled a little bit, and it was sweet. It was sweet and cute. It was good though, but it was a challenging message. I'm glad we're past that, so open your Bibles to Proverbs chapter 6. We've been working our way sequentially through the book of Proverbs. This book becomes more and more dear to me as I work my way through it. And the first 9 chapters of Proverbs are lectures or lessons for Solomon's son on how to avoid some of the pitfalls in life. The one thing that kind of keeps being underscored in my heart is I've been in pastoral ministry for over 25 years now, and just now working my way through it. Our 4 boys are all grown, and my only regret is that I didn't do this 25 years ago. This is kind of a premier book on parenting, and having read it, having studied it, but never to the level of preaching and working through it. There are just so many things within this book that are so helpful for a parent trying to help their child get through life in a manner that honors Christ. It is indeed priceless. In Proverbs, Solomon doesn't want his son to be enrolled in the school of hard knocks, but he wants to impart God's wisdom so that he might live in a wiser way. Solomon understands that a hard heart leads to a hard life, and there aren't any guarantees that his son is going to listen, but Solomon wants to be a faithful father who communicates truth for life. If you've not been with us so far, just do a flyover by way of summary. Chapters 1 through 4 in Proverbs deal with wisdom in a very, very general way. Solomon is teaching wisdom to his son. The first 9 chapters are 10 lectures or 10 lessons about wisdom for life. In chapter 5, he begins to become very specific, addressing the topic of sexual purity or sexual sin. And in it, in chapter 5, Solomon warns his son what to avoid, and he warns his son what to embrace. In chapter 6, though, Solomon explains to his son how to protect his future. Now, I never really thought about it in this way, but kind of studying this within its context and understanding it better now, he is helping his son to prepare for life. He is helping his son to prepare to protect his future. And in particular, he's explaining to his son how to be wise in the way that he handles money and how to be wise in the way that he handles his time. In other words, you can learn much about a person by looking at their checkbook and by examining their calendar. If you look at those 2 indicators, you can tell whether or not a person is living by God's wisdom based on how they spend the resources that the Lord entrusts to them and how they use their time. In our text for today, though, Solomon addresses 2 more unwise practices, and the first of those was in listening to the adulteress. But now he teaches his son about the need to limit his liability and to limit his laziness. And the reason why you can see that is because in chapter 6 in verse number 1, he says, "My son, if you have become surety for your neighbor and have given a pledge for a stranger." And so this is going to address the subject of financial liability in the first 5 verses. And then in verse number 6, he says, "Go to the ant, O sluggard." And then in verse number 9, "How long will you lie down, O sluggard?" And so Solomon is really teaching his son about limiting financial liability and limiting personal laziness. And this is how he writes what he writes under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Proverbs 6 and verse number 1. My son, if you become surety for your neighbor, have given a pledge for a stranger, if you have been snared with the words of your mouth, have been caught with the words of your mouth, do this then, my son, and deliver yourself, since you have come into the hand of your neighbor. Go, humble yourself, and importune your neighbor. Do not give sleep to your eyes, nor slumber to your eyelids. Deliver yourself like a gazelle from the hunter's hand, and like a bird from the hand of the fowler. Go to the ant, O sluggard, observe her ways and be wise, which having no chief, officer, or ruler, prepares her food in the summer and gathers her provision in the harvest. How long will you lie down, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and your poverty will come in like a vagabond, and your need like an armed man. What's going on here is that in Proverbs 6, 1 through 11, Solomon is detailing two unwise vices to avoid. In other words, he has just addressed his son and taught him about the need to abstain from sexual sin. And now there are two more vices he is to avoid. The first of those is the vice of foolish liability, which he chronicles in verses 1 through 5. And then unproductive laziness is what he addresses in verses 6 through 11. So again, think about this as a parent teaching their child, pushing into their child's life, whether the child wants to listen or not, taking the time in a loving way to build a solid foundation into the life of a child for a heart that pleases God. And not only is it good for parenting and knowing that this is a wonderful resource for how to parent our kids and what lessons to teach our kids, but also what we should be practicing ourselves, because it is indeed hypocrisy for us to teach one thing and model something different. And so these are great lessons, not just for parents, really, but for all of us to be able to learn. Here's the first vice to avoid. Avoid the vice of foolish liability. Verse number 1, my son, you see it's a new topic, a new speech, a new lecture, if you will. My son, if you have become surety for your neighbor or have given a pledge for a stranger. Now, if you were just reading that, you might start looking for a marginal note because you might not know what it means to become surety for your neighbor. Not the way we talk, not the way that contracts are written for the most part. What is surety? Surety is when you make yourself liable for or responsible for paying the debt of another person should that person become unable to pay. In other words, you become the guarantor for the debt. Or we could say it this way, you co-sign for that person, guaranteeing with your signature, with your resources, that their financial obligations are guaranteed to be paid by you. You know, what's interesting is that often if someone defaults on something like that, they won't even go after the person who is the original borrower because they know they don't have any financial resources. They're going to come directly after you as the cosigner because you have the ability to pay. And that's what they're going to focus on. The book of Proverbs has quite a bit to say about surety or becoming surety or a cosigner for someone else. Listen to what it says in Proverbs 11 and verse 15. He who is surety for a stranger will surely suffer for it, but he who hates going surety is safe. Proverbs 17 and verse number 18, a man lacking in sense pledges and becomes surety in the presence of his neighbor. Proverbs 22 and verse 26, do not be among those who give pledges, among those who become surety for debts. No less than 4 times, Solomon is warning against co-signing for anyone, against guaranteeing a debt. In fact, he mentions the possibility of becoming surety for two different types of people. The first is a neighbor, and the second is a stranger. And whenever you understand that Solomon is the king of Israel, it gives a little bit of context for understanding this. A neighbor as a general term can mean virtually anyone, but it would mean a fellow Israelite. It would mean a personal friend, someone that you know well, someone that is part of your community, not necessarily your neighbor or even lives on your street or in your neighborhood, but is part of your people, is maybe someone that you know really, really well. The stranger that he mentions in the latter part of verse number 1 of having given a pledge for a stranger means a non-Israelite, a Gentile, someone who is not part of your normal community. Maybe you know them a little, maybe you know them none. But what's interesting is this covers the range of becoming surety for virtually anyone. No matter whether they're part of your family or whether they're not, whether they're someone that you really don't know hardly at all. This seems to be a warning against co-signing for anyone. As I was reading this, I was reminded that the Old Testament encouraged generosity and lending without interest. In fact, Deuteronomy 15 and several places within the Old Testament, Exodus 22, Leviticus 25, did not permit reasonable interest to be charged to an Israelite. In other words, if you were a Jew and you wanted to loan some money to another Jew, you weren't allowed to charge any kind of interest at all. However, if they were a Gentile, you were allowed to charge a small amount of interest, a moral amount of interest. But what the Old Testament also says that you are not allowed to charge excessive interest to anyone. In other words, the amount of interest charged today on a payday loan or a car title loan is considered immoral or sinful, and no one is to ever charge that amount of interest. And the reason why people would be willing to pay those types of interest, those levels or rates, is because either they're foolish, number one, or they're desperate, number two. In other words, they need that money so badly that they're willing to be taken advantage of by someone who is charging usury or an immoral amount of interest. The point here is that even though generosity was encouraged, you should not make foolish, rash financial commitments. In Solomon's day, you became surety for your neighbor by giving a pledge. Literally, the text says, clapping your hands or your palms together. We would have it as a handshake today. In that culture, it was a way of making a commitment. And evidently, Solomon is warning that this is a dangerous thing. You should not do it. But if it happened, this is the instruction he has for his son. My son, if you have become surety for your neighbor, have given a pledge for a stranger, if you have been snared, notice the wording now, if you have been snared with the words of your mouth, have been caught with the words of your mouth. These are hunting terms. This is what a hunter would do in order to secure his game. He would set a snare to catch the unsuspecting animal. He would catch them, and here it says, with the words of your mouth. In other words, this is something that is unexpected. This is something that is completely dangerous. The wise father is teaching his son, be careful what you say and be careful what you do, lest rash, foolish commitments might snare you as a hunter would his game or catch you with the words of your mouth. The implication is that a person should be very wise considering the commitments that they are making. Here's an implication. You should never sign a legal document without reading all of the fine print. And you think, really? Have you seen how many pages? I've not only seen it, I read them all. It's almost like a curse. I know that if I have to sign for something like that, I want to go through it line by line or have someone close to me do that, making sure that I understand what I'm signing. That's one of the points here. You should not make rash promises that you might later find difficult to keep. Now, I don't know here if Solomon is writing from personal experience, if he had a bad experience, if he became surety for someone, if he gave a pledge for a stranger, or whether this is just God's wisdom that he gave to Solomon. I don't know the background from it, but the bad practice of co-signing seems important enough that it has become a vital lesson he desires to teach his son. Not only about marital fidelity, but also about financial stability. In fact, being responsible in this way, and not just once, but several times, Solomon is going to warn that God's wisdom will keep you from entering into this type of an agreement. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, well, wait a second, my son just asked me to co-sign on a car for him, or does that mean that I shouldn't have done that? Does that mean that I should not have signed as a guarantor for a loan for my son or my daughter to attend college? And the answer is, I don't know. It's questionable. Not necessarily is that what it's saying, because it would just depend on the situation. However, it would be wise for you, before you guarantee the payment of a loan for anyone, that you know that person's character well as you understand their plan for repayment, and you know that they have the ability to meet that financial obligation. Very often is the case that someone who needs a cosigner is just concerned about getting the loan, getting the resources, and they haven't gone through the minutia of thinking of worst case scenarios. What will happen if you don't have the resources? How are you going to pay for this? What if things don't happen the way that you think that they might? Do you understand the responsibility involved? You should also be willing and able to meet the financial obligation should the need arise. In other words, you need to factor in that worst case, you're going to have to pay for this. And if you're not able to do it, and if you're not willing to do it, then don't co-sign. So here's the question. What do you do if you signed a risky contract and didn't read the fine print? All right, let me just be very personal, very anecdotal. What do you do if in 1989 you co-signed for the purchase of a 1973 green and white Volkswagen bus that your newly saved Christian stepbrother wanted to buy because you both were surfers, but he probably wasn't going to be able to afford it? Well, that's a great question. Where was Solomon in 1989 for me? Solomon's answer is get out of the contract as soon as possible. Don't do it. Why? Because it's likely that you will have to assume the responsibility for the debt. Well, there's your answer on how things turned out for me. Think about it for just a second. If the person is not stable enough to secure the debt on his or her own, it is probable, it is not certain, but it is probable that he or she will not be able to service the debt moving forward. That's why they needed a cosigner in the first place. There are other options. Instead of co-signing, you could simply give them the money. In fact, listen to Deuteronomy chapter 15. Deuteronomy chapter 15 in verses 7 through 11. Very, very helpful. God is telling his covenant people, he says, if there is a poor man with you, one of your brothers, in any of your towns, in your land, which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, now close your hand from your poor brother. But you shall freely open your hand to him and shall generously lend him sufficient for his need in whatever he lacks. Beware lest there is a base thought in your heart saying, the seventh year, the year of remission is near. In other words, every 7 years, debts were forgiven. What if he comes on year number 6 and he wants to borrow money and you're thinking, because you're not going to be able to pay all of this back before next year, and I'm going to have to forgive this debt. God says, don't be hard-hearted and turn away from the need of your brother. Beware lest there is a base thought in your heart saying the 7th year, the year of remission is near, and your eye is hostile toward your poor brother, and you give him nothing. Then he may cry to the Lord against you, and it will be a sin in you. You shall generously give to him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all your undertakings. For the poor will never cease to be in the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy, and poor in your land. What a great text. It encourages generosity amongst God's people. In other words, you're giving to them, even being aware that you might not receive anything in return, and yet you're still willing to do it. So that's a great way to approach it. That's one thing that could be done, but evidently that's not the situation that Solomon is describing. In fact, here, he's saying something completely different. He's saying here that evidently his son would become surety for another. What do you do in that case? Verse number 3 says that you should seek release deliberately. In other words, what you might have thought was a good deed has turned out to be a foolish deed. And the cosigner has failed to count the cost of his rash commitment. So verse number 3, he says, do this then, my son. There's the first command, do this, and deliver yourself. There's command number 2. Since you have come into the hand of your neighbor, command number 3, go. Command number 4, humble yourself. Command number 5, and importune your neighbor. In other words, you are trapped in a bad situation. You have come into the hand of your neighbor, meaning that you are no longer able to determine how to steward what God has entrusted to you. The stewardship that the Lord has given to you has been compromised. Therefore, you have to find a way out, and you need to act quickly. Go. Humble yourself. Go means don't wait. Go right now. Humble yourself means beg if you must. Importune your neighbor. Scott, what in the world does that mean? It means that you should speak strongly to him. You should even badger him, is one translation. You should make yourself obnoxious to that person until they release you. In other words, you keep texting them, you keep calling them, you keep going by. Listen, I know that I said that I would do it, but I've got to get out of it. I'm not going to go through with this. You need to let me out of it. Go ahead and cut me loose. You've got to get free. This is a serious situation. You need to get out now. Do what you have to do, Solomon says. Admit that you were wrong. Renege on your promise. Badger your friend to let you out. It might be distasteful. It might be humiliating. You might have egg on your face. But according to Solomon, it's necessary. This is far better for you to be humbled than for you to have to pay this debt that you never wanted to incur. Further, it's a great reminder that if you had been more prudent, more thoughtful in this matter, you could have avoided this predicament completely. Solomon says, if this is you, if you speak rashly, if you get yourself into this situation, seek release deliberately. And then verses 4 and 5, obtain release quickly. Verse 4, do not give sleep to your eyes, nor slumber to your eyelids. In other words, don't hesitate. Don't sleep on it. No naps. Don't wait till tomorrow. Nothing seems to be as urgent as this need to free yourself from this unwise commitment. Time will not make this any better. In fact, verse 5, deliver yourself. There's another command. Deliver yourself in 2 ways, like a gazelle from the hunter's hand and like a bird from the hand of the fowler. These are 2 lessons that Solomon takes from nature, and if you've ever seen a hunter that has grabbed hold of a living animal, that animal will do everything in its power in order to get free. And that is exactly what he's saying here. Now, here's the question. Why would you ever want to become surety for your neighbor, a family member, or even a stranger? Well, at the time, it might seem like a right thing to do. They need maybe some transportation. They may need a loan for something or think that they need a loan for something. And maybe you even have a Christian brother or sister who seems nice and well-intentioned. And hey, you want to encourage them. And you're stable in your financial resources, but they simply can't make this purchase. And so you might think, why not? What can it hurt? Or it may be that you were like me in 1989 and you'd never dealt with this type of a request before, and it seemed innocent enough. So why wouldn't I help this person out? I mean, they're a new brother in the Lord. Why not? The Lord will take care of me, right? Not necessarily. This is not always the best thing to do. First, you might be helping him or her to buy something that is a want and not a need. Second, you might be encouraging them to spend money that they simply can't afford. Third, if he or she defaults on the loan and you have to pay for something that you didn't want and that you don't need, it will be difficult for you to maintain that friendship, and bitterness is probably going to set in. Worse, it will limit your liability to properly steward the resources that God has entrusted to you. You realize, don't you, that you're a steward of what God allows you to take care of for a while? In other words, it's not ours. It really belongs to the Lord. And he entrusts you with the stewardship, and he expects you to be faithful. And he wants you to be wise and direct that stewardship into the care of God's work, provision of your family, and even in helping others. But if you don't have that ability because of an unwise business decision that you made, it is going to change relationships with people. Dave Ramsey has a great line that I like. He said, co-signing on a note or loaning your relatives money changes the taste of Thanksgiving turkey. It really does. I mean, think about it for a second. Whenever you see them or whenever you meet together with them for a holiday, and if they hit you up for a loan, right, or they had you co-sign and the thing has fallen through, and they're not making their payments, you are going to be scrutinizing every purchase that they make or whatever you hear them talking about. In fact, if you're there at Thanksgiving, the Thanksgiving meal, and they've got the latest iPhone, right, and they're checking their media post or what's going on Facebook or whatever, and you're looking at, when did you get the money to get that? Or if she's got her nails done and, just looking, just really, really great, and yet what? They're not able to make the payments to you or on the loan. I mean, it is just really going to be a source for bitterness in your heart. It's much better just to forgive them the debt and give them the money. So let me just make a word of application here. If you're in a credit arrangement that is holding you hostage, you must get free. If you're a co-signer on a note, you need to do whatever possible to encourage that person to refinance that loan or to get into a position to where they can handle the payments themselves. Or if you have asked someone else to do this for you, you need to set that person free. You need to work as hard as you can in order to get to a position to where you're able to shoulder the burden yourself. Take responsibility for yourself and allow the other person to do the same. Solomon is helping his son to navigate a future struggle. He's warning him, he's instructing him what to do if you get yourself into this situation. While foolish financial practices may ruin you, laziness is another path to destruction. Now, why is laziness such an issue? And I just want to warn you, this may get a little bit uncomfortable for everybody, but why is laziness such an issue? Because number one, it's being encouraged culturally. I don't know if you see what's going on in our country, but the present political leadership of our country is steering us toward socialism. In other words, our political leaders are trying to hand out money to people. All of those payouts that have been coming from the government, they're discouraging people from going to work. They have boosted the amount of unemployment, and the message is stay at home and let the government support you. And if the government can have our people to become accustomed to merely cashing a check and not working, they're going to continue to vote for the people who are paying them the checks and keep those people in office. It is simply a plot and a ploy for them to maintain a position of leadership. And unfortunately, it seems to be working. I noticed this whenever we were in Florida on vacation. There were a lot of places that had signs that they were hiring people. In fact, it seemed like most places that we went had signs that they were hiring people, but not many people were willing to work. In fact, you would make more money staying at home than actually working for a living. In fact, this week we were going to lunch with the pastors. We have a pastor's lunch each week, and we were standing in line. I was ordering a hamburger for lunch, and I was just trying to be friendly with the guy who was taking my order. And I said, hey, are you guys hiring here? And he said, yeah, we are. And I said, but are you having trouble getting people to work? And he goes, yeah, we are completely. And I said, yeah, it's kind of funny what's going on. He said, yeah, unemployment basically keeps people from working. And this is what he said to me. He said, to be quite honest, unemployment is looking pretty good to me right now. In other words, I would rather sit at home on the couch and collect and cash unemployment checks than to be here working for a living. And I said, yeah, but you know what? There's a dignity associated with having a job and earning money to support yourself. Now, here's what I want you to realize, and as a parent, and maybe as you parent your children, or even as an adult, if you're out of work, the government in this culture, at least those who are in positions of leadership right now, are going to make it easier and more desirable for you to stay at home and not get out and get a job. But not only is it being encouraged culturally, but many young men are prone to laziness. Young men are prone to not working hard, not being diligent, not being industrious, and not being persistent. In fact, whenever I was working through the book of Titus, there's a section in Titus chapter 2 where Paul is addressing how Titus should speak to certain people groups within the church. Older men, there's a list of things that Titus should teach them. Older women, a list of things Titus should teach them. Younger women, a whole list of things they should learn. For young men, one thing: be sensible, be sober-minded. In other words, you need to approach life understanding that there is more than just the here and now. You need to be thinking through life and what is going to happen, because Paul knew that it is outside of the mindset of a young man to consider his future. He is only taken with what happens right now. And as a result, there's a satisfaction with just sort of coasting in life. I was listening to a pastor, to a preacher this week on this topic, and he mentioned previously articles that were written on the subject of cadults. And you might say, well, what's a cadult? A cadult is an adult who acts like a kid. And several of the articles mentioned that some men in their late 20s and early 30s are living with their parents, not working, not being responsible, playing video games at night, sleeping in, and mooching off mom and dad. And the sad thing is that there are parents who love their adult children enough that they're trying to insulate them and help them in life, but these adult kids are just taking advantage of their parents, and the parents need to understand that the helping is actually hurting. One of the articles called them boomerang kids. You send them out and they keep coming back. The temptation for young men is to waste their lives in thoughtless, unproductive ways. Now, listen, if you're a young man here, I am not trying to offend you. I'm not. I'm just trying to warn you that there is a natural inclination of our fallen heart that you need to be aware of, and by God's grace and with God's help, that there is help for you in this passage. But it's not just for young men. What Solomon has to say in this passage is here for the rest of us, because there is within our heart a tendency toward laziness. Maybe it's in laziness in one area and not others, but there's a tendency in our heart to become a sluggard, as Solomon calls them. What is a sluggard, you might ask? Ray Ortlund answers that question in this way. Think of the way that syrup oozes slowly out of a bottle when it's cold. That is the sluggard. Sluggish, slow, and hesitant when he should be decisive, active, and forthright. His life motto is, "Don't rush me." He is lazy, constantly making the soft choices in life, losing one opportunity after another, and after another, day by day, moment by moment, until he lies there helpless in his wasted life. The Bible has quite a bit to say about the sluggard, especially in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 6 and verse 9, 10 and verse 26, 13 and verse 4, 15 and verse 19, 19 and verse 24, 20 and verse 4, 21 and verse 25, 22 and verse 13, 24 and verse 30, 26 and verses 13 through 16, again and again and again and again, Solomon warns against being lazy. Although Solomon uses the term sluggard twice in this passage, I don't think he's calling his sons sluggards, but he's warning them not to become lazy. So the first vice that you want to avoid is the vice of foolish liability, and the second vice that you want to avoid is shun the vice of unproductive laziness. It's here in verses 6 through 11. There's a lesson that Solomon wants to teach his son, and there is an unlikely teacher. It is Professor Ant. Notice verse 6, "Go to the ant, O sluggard. Observe her ways and be wise." 3 commands. I want you to go to the ant. I want you to observe. There's the second command, or watch her ways. And then the third command, I want you to be wise. I want you to learn wisdom from how the ant behaves. In other words, you are to learn lessons from the ant. It's here in verses 6 through 8. There are 3 lessons that you can learn. Number 1, ants work hard. Evidently, the ant models a solid work ethic by demonstrating self-motivation, diligence, and planning. Ants always seem busy. Ants always seem to be working hard. When is the last time that you found an ant pile in which they were just kind of laying around doing nothing, right? They're just busy. I mean, they're going everywhere and doing everything. And man, if they find a crumb of food, I mean, they're on it. We get ants from time to time around our house. And normally there's this train of ants where they're just in this long procession. And it's amazing to find where they're going. I mean, they're just always working. Solomon wasn't the only one to be impressed with the ant. In Proverbs 30 and verse 25, King Agur writes this, "The ants are not a strong folk, but they prepare their food in the summer." Solomon says here to his son, "Go to the ant, O sluggard, observe her ways and be wise." Now, can't you just imagine this teenage young man? He's probably what, 5'8", 5'11", maybe 130 to 160 pounds, is supposed to lumber up to an anthill and look at this tiny, tiny insect that is probably not as big, or that isn't as big as a corner of his fingernail, right? This guy weighs so much, this ant weighs so little, he's so large, it's so small, his brain is big. This ant's brain is so small, but this ant is able to teach a valuable lesson for life. Notice verse number 7. He says, "Which having no chief, officer, or ruler, prepares her food in the summer and gathers her provision in the harvest." In other words, ants show initiative. They don't need someone telling them what to do. And most people work hard when the boss is present, right? And most people, if your boss is there, you're busy. You're finding something to do if you weren't doing anything previously. But this is different. Not many people work hard when the boss is not there. The ant doesn't appear to have any leader, any type of formal organization, but his instincts compel him to work and to work diligently. They don't need someone reminding them to get started. They don't need someone to tell them to get up. They don't need someone to tell them to get to work, to keep working, to work hard, to stay with it. You're almost done. Let's go, let's go, let's go. There doesn't seem to be anyone doing that with the ants. They are simply working hard. They show initiative. Well, ants are self-starters, but this is very, very different from the sluggard. The sluggard seems to be the opposite. You have to tell them to get up and get up and get up. Did you realize that your alarm went off 3 times? Do you realize that you've now hit the snooze button 5 times? Do you realize what time it is? What time are you supposed to be at work? Do you realize that traffic is going to be bad? Do you realize that you've already been late 2 times this week already? And so there needs to be this again and again and again. All right, have you ever walked up on someone when something's going on and someone's just standing there and you're going, okay, what are you doing? Well, I'm just waiting on something to do. Well, you don't see that right there that needs to be done, or you don't see that over there that needs to be done? I mean, let's just get with it. I mean, it's right there in front of you here, right? And yet ants don't need to be told what to do. They show initiative. Finally, number 3, ants prepare for the future. In other words, ants plan ahead. She understands the seasons and works while food is available. If you ever drop food on the ground, it doesn't take very long for the ants to find it, for the ants to get in there, for them to begin to tote it off. They demonstrate wisdom by preparing food in the summer and gathering food during the harvest because they know that winter is coming. Jim Neuheiser writes this: just as the ant prepares for the winter, so the wise worker is forward-thinking. The plans of the diligent lead surely to advantage. When he is young, he chooses a career that will utilize his abilities and by which he can provide well for his family. He then pursues the necessary training to be successful. He is willing to prove himself doing menial labor in the short term so that he can be promoted later. In contrast, the sluggard seems to do the opposite. The only season that he keeps in view is the present. Parents, listen, you need to teach your kids how to work hard. You need to teach your children to have a solid work ethic because they're not going to have it naturally. They are just not going to do it. We have 4 sons, and by God's grace, they are all hard workers, but it didn't start out that way. And whenever we would be busy working outside and it was hot, I would look up and a couple of them would be gone. And I would think, where in the world did they go? And I'm not going to name which ones that it was, but a couple would be gone, and I go inside and find them doing something else. Hey, what are you doing? We're not done. I know, but it was hot out there. You're telling me it is hot. It's still hot out there, you know. But I don't want to do that anymore. I know, but I don't want to do it either. But we work until it's done. Come on, put that down and come back out. And you know what? It was a hard lesson, but by God's grace, children can be taught in that way. And that is probably one of the greatest lessons that you will teach your children, is to have a hard work ethic, to stick with it, to stay with it. And that is exactly what is going on here. Ants work hard. Ants show initiative. Ants prepare for the future. Parents, do you realize that it's a difficult, challenging thing to help your children think through where they're going to go, what they're going to do in life? Do you realize that they're not aware of the gifts that God has given them? And it's up to you as a parent in the proper manner to help them to think through where they're going and how they're going to prepare in order to provide for what they need. They don't understand how much life costs or what life involves. And so it's up to us as parents in a loving and gracious way to try to steer and guide them in the proper lanes so that they can make the proper preparations. These are lessons that Solomon wants to teach through the ant. Not only does he say you should learn lessons from the ant, but verses 9 through 11, you should avoid the habits of the sluggard. Notice verse number 9. It's probably one that you'll want to underline. How long will you lie down, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? By the way, this is a great verse to text to someone who is overslept and is late for a meeting with you, right? You can text them this and it communicates the point very effectively. Maybe the question of shame is meant to prod him into acting responsibly, right? How long will you lie down, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? By the way, there's nothing wrong with sleep in and of itself. In fact, sweet sleep is a blessing that God gives to those who walk in wisdom. Proverbs 3 and verse number 24 says, when you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Proverbs 19 and verse 23, the fear of the Lord leads to life, so that one may sleep satisfied, untouched by evil. As you get older in life, you find that it's hard to get a good night's sleep, and you really appreciate it whenever you do. But for the sluggard, too much sleep is an expression of his laziness. Proverbs 19 and verse 15 says, laziness casts into a deep sleep, and an idle man will suffer hunger. Proverbs 20 and verse 13, do not love sleep, lest you become poor. Open your eyes, and you will be satisfied with food. In fact, the sluggard doesn't seem any need to develop and use the gifts that God has given him to provide for his family. In fact, he looks upon work as an evil to be avoided. His greatest friend seems to be the snooze button on his alarm. In fact, Proverbs 26 and verse 14 says, as the door turns on its hinges, so does the sluggard on his bed. What does this text teach us about the sluggard? Number one, that he loves leisure. This is what he says in verse 10. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. It's not a big deal. In other words, he seems to be justifying why he sleeps so much. But the truth is, he's just lazy. Present leisure is all he really thinks about and all he really provides for. He doesn't get out of bed on time for work, maybe because he stayed up too late the night before having fun. He knows that he should get up, but the sluggard delights in his sleep. He's not concerned with the future. He thinks it will be provided for him when it comes, just like the present, and he ends up wasting his life. Is that you? And I know you might not be a young man or even a young lady, but is that you? Do you love leisure too much? Nothing wrong with resting, nothing wrong with relaxing. God has meant us to unstring the bow. He's meant us to rest. But do you love entertainment too much? I think that's one of the marks of the next generation that's coming up, is just this infatuation with leisure and entertainment. It's just all about movies and games and just not working hard. And you just have to really think through this. Do you stay up late at night playing so that it's hard for you to rise early in the morning? We have tried to teach our family that Sunday morning starts on Saturday night. And that's a great expression for life, or philosophy for life. Sometimes you have to prepare for the next day by getting a good night's sleep the night before. And if you don't, then you find that it's really difficult to stay awake the next day. Maybe you can wake your neighbor up and tell him what I just said that's there beside you. Do you understand the gifts that God has given you? Do you understand the need to develop and use those gifts? Are you willing to work hard now so that you can be properly prepared for life later? Young men, do you realize that God will have you to lead a family? You'll have a mortgage. God willing, you'll have children. You'll have to provide insurance. You'll have to provide food. I mean, it is amazing the responsibility that you'll have, and you need to talk to your parents or those people in your life who know you well that can help you to prepare and develop the gifts that God has given you so that you might properly steward what God has entrusted to you. It's going to require for you to work hard. It's going to require you to make sacrifices and for you to give up some of the playtime. Do you understand that work is not a bad thing, but it's a necessary part of how you can honor God, provide for your family, and contribute to the community? There is nothing any more holy or more sanctified about a pastor than a school teacher, than an IT worker, than even a lawyer. I mean, why are you giggling about that? There are Christian lawyers, amen? There's not a lot, but there's some. You can honor God through whatever vocation that the Lord has called you to by simply working hard and for His glory. Solomon is helping us to understand that the sluggard loves leisure. And here's the last part of it. The sluggard lacks foresight. It's right here in verse number 9. Solomon is teaching his son what will ultimately happen to those who are lazy. Verse 11, your poverty will come in like a vagabond and your need like an armed man. In other words, you don't see the need in order to prepare for the future, but you have to think ahead and you have to work hard while you're able. If you don't, your future is going to be bleak. Someone said it like this: laziness is the parent of poverty. Laziness is a character flaw. Laziness is sin. It seems that we all have a little bit of laziness in us. We're normally lazy about the things that we don't want to do. We try to put it off, right, until we finally have to do it, instead of doing the hardest things first. You see, if you have the character flaw of being lazy, you have two things to look forward to in life. Solomon tells us that they are poverty and need. Proverbs 10 and verse number 4 says, poor is he who works with a negligent hand, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. Proverbs 13 and verse 4, the soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing, but the soul of the diligent is made fat. Proverbs 20 and verse number 4, the sluggard does not plow after the autumn, and so he begs during the harvest and has nothing. Poverty and need will come upon you, not suddenly, but it will come in two ways. Like a vagabond, that's some sort of a dangerous robber who sneaks in and steals from you, and like an armed man, literally a man of shield. This is a military man who is well armed and moves quietly and moves quickly. You see, if you are lazy, you may not see your poverty coming, but Solomon guarantees that it will arrive. How so? Because you are wasting your time, wasting your talents, wasting your earning power. Precious hours, important opportunities, and years of productivity will be squandered away because you lack enthusiasm and initiative. Solomon advises you, learn from the ant. Go look at what he does. Look at how hard he works. Understand that he has a goal in mind. One commentator said it this way: the ant works for tomorrow today. She is not hoping that life will go her way. She gets out ahead of the next season of life, doing what needs to be done. Do you realize how gracious God is to help us to parent our children? To help us to understand the tendencies of our fallen human heart to go in ways that they simply shouldn't, whether it's being foolish in the financial commitments that we're making, or whether it's being unproductively lazy in life. God says that these are vices that need to be avoided. They're what we should teach our kids, and they're what we should live out. And it's all possible because of the gospel and how God has given us the ability to honor Him. If you're here today and if you've never trusted in Christ, laziness is not your real problem. Your real problem is that you're a rebel against God. And yet God gives an opportunity for you to be reconciled to Him and for Christ to become the center of your life, and He gives you the ability to obey Him. If I can help you with that, I would love to talk to you afterwards about it. But for other believers who are here, what a great passage to learn. What a great passage to model. I hope that you will use it not only for your personal life, but as you parent your children. Would you please stand together with me as we pray? Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity to sit under the authority of your word. We understand that it's sufficient for life. Lord, thank you for helping us to think through how we care for people who are in financial need. Maybe it's better for us to simply give to them and meet the need than it is to enter in a co-signing relationship. Father, I pray that you would help us to be wise for the future in our finances and wise in the future for our laziness. Help us to do hard things first. Help us to learn from the ant. God, help us to not be lazy in the way that we live. We're grateful for rest. We're grateful for vacations. We're grateful for leisure and entertainment, but may we understand what place they hold in life, and may you help us to be productive for your glory. We just want to commit our hearts to you and ask that you would bless us this day as we go forward. Father, thank you for those men and women who have made the ultimate sacrifice and given their lives for this country in the military so that we might worship you in freedom. We ask that you would bless their families who are now without them. Be with us as we go forth from this place, for we pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.